Okay, so in Europe, African migration is often perceived as permanent for people in general. There is this general impression that migrants never return unless they are encouraged or forced to return. And in the last decades, migration in Europe has generated increasing policy attention. For policymakers, the priority now is the return of undocumented migrants, as Ariane just explained. And for that purpose, they implement different kinds of measures, such as the readmission agreements, removals of undocumented migrants, and they encourage migrants to return via their voluntary soft deportation or voluntary return programs. So, Hein explained to you this morning that generally migration policies have become less restrictive over time, generally. But when we look at African migrants in Europe, this is not really the case. This is not the case at all, let's say. So the restrictive migration policies, they have mainly targeted African migrants in the last decades. And of course, it is especially the case for undocumented migrants and not really for, or less for high-skilled migrants. So we can say that migration policies depends on not only on the categories of migrants, but also they vary according to the different destination countries. And at the same time, so migration policies have become more restrictive, but we see that there is also an increase in migration flows to Europe. So in a destination country perspective, there's an increase of African migration to Europe, as the DEMIG C2C database shows. So in this paper, I conceptualize return migration as a function of migrants' aspiration and capabilities to return. So this conceptual framework was used by Hein de Haas for conceptualizing immigration, and here I use it to conceptualize return migration. So I consider that migrants will return if they perceive good opportunities for them and for their family in their origin country. And at the same time, they must, something which is very important, is that they must have the capability to return. It means that they need sufficient earning, because it's very important for their reintegration in their country of origin, but they also need this ability to circulate. It's important to take into account, because migrants, return is a risk, and migrants won't take this risk to return if they know that it will be difficult to come back to Europe again. If in case of problem, they may experience failure of their reintegration, or crisis in their origin country. So they could need to migrate again to Europe, and if they know that it is difficult, they won't return. So in this paper, in this research, I want to study the effect of restrictive migration policies on return. And I distinguish between three types of migration policies. The policies controlling the access of migrants, firstly. Secondly, the policies controlling the stay of migrants in Europe. And thirdly, the policies encouraging or forcing migrants to return. In the first case, for policies controlling the access of migrants, my hypothesis is that the harder it is to migrate to a country, and the less migrants return, because return is a risk, and it's important for them to have this ability to circulate and to come back in case of problem. For policies controlling the stay of migrants, the effect which is expected is ambiguous, because on the one hand, migration policies which are restrictive may be a problem for the integration of migrants at destination, and migrants may decide to come back because the cost of migration is higher than expected, and it's better for them to go back. But in the other hand, migrants may postpone their return because of the difficulties in their integration, because they need more time to acquire the resource that they need before returning. So the effects may go in the two different senses. And thirdly, my hypothesis for the policies encouraging or forcing migrants to return is that I don't think that we will have any, at the beginning I thought that I didn't expect any impact of those policies, because return policies are generally not very well implemented, and because return is driven by other factors. So my research is based on, my case study is the case of Senegalese migrants in Europe. And France is the first destination, at least after the independence of Senegal and to the first decade. But we see that in the 90s especially, and in the years 2000, Italy and Spain emerged as new destinations, and the USA and Canada to a lesser extent. So we see that there has been a diversification of the destination countries for Senegalese migrants. And so the population that I take into account in this research is the Senegalese who migrated to France, Italy, and Spain for at least 1 year. So to conduct such analysis, we need two kinds of data: individual data on migrants, and contextual data on the level of restrictiveness of migration policies. So at first, for my individual data are based on the biographical survey MAFE Senegal, so coming from the Migration Between Africa and Europe project. And those data present two advantages. At first, they are transnational. It means that we have information on, they have been collected both in origin and destination countries. So we have information on migrants who have returned and on those who haven't returned, so who are still in a destination. And this is very important to be able to study return migration. And those data are also longitudinal. It means that we have the information on the life histories of migrants since the time of their arrival in Europe and each year until their eventual return. So we have information on their family situation, professional situation, on their legal status, and so on and so on. And to assess the level of restrictiveness of migration policy, I used the DEMIG policy database. And I recodified the major changes in migration policies for non-European migrants. So I did that for the three types of migration policies: those regulating the access of migrants to Europe, those regulating the stay of migrants to Europe, and those encouraging or forcing migrants to return. And this data gives information on the level of restrictiveness of policies for the different categories of migrants. So we can distinguish between undocumented migrants, low-skilled workers, high-skilled workers, asylum seekers, and students. And the data are coded +1 each time that a measure intends to restrict the right of a migrant category, and -1 when it intends to increase the rights of a migrant category. Once the data were ready, I merged them, so I merged individual and contextual data together on the basis of the category of migrants and for each year of the migration. And I will give you the example of Amadou. So Amadou, he arrived in Spain, migrated to Spain in 2000. Yes, in 2000, and he stayed until the time of the survey in 2010. Migration policies have evolved during his stay in Spain, but his status has also changed over time. So we see that when he arrived, he was undocumented, irregular, and in 2004, he became low-skilled workers. So he got paper in 2004. At the time of when he was irregular, the level of restrictiveness of access policies was those policies were very restrictive, so a level of 7. So it means, it was, at the time in Spain, it was very difficult for irregular migrants to enter into Spain. So the state policies were also more restrictive than when he got paper in 2004. Policies are less restrictive state policies are less restrictive for him at that time. And we also see that for access policies, once he got papers, the level of restrictiveness is lower. So it shows that the level of restrictiveness of migration policy varies according years and according the category of migrants. So I did an event history logistics regression, and the event that I want to study here is return migration, to return for at least more than 1 year in Senegal. So this is not a return for holidays and so on. I am interested in aspiration and for return and so the intention to return, as well as in migration policies. I control for a series of variables, and my sample contains nearly 7,000 person years observation and 91 returns. So my results shows at first that so this is the effect of policies regulating the access of migrants to Europe. And we see that when migrants face high level of restrictiveness in access policy, they are less likely to return compared to period of lower restrictions. So it shows that migrants know that this is a risk for them to return when they are not allowed to come back easily. So they decide to stay in Europe. Secondly, I showed the effect of policies controlling the stay of migrants in Europe, and you see that the level of restrictiveness of those policies does not affect the return of migrants. So it shows that some migrants decided to return maybe because it was difficult to integrate in Europe, while some others had to extend their stay in Europe, to postpone their return because they need more time to integrate and to acquire resources in Europe for their return. And thirdly, I show that the effect of policies encouraging or forcing migrants to return, and when the level of restrictiveness of policies encouraging or forcing migrants to return is high, migrants are less likely to return than when this level is low. So this result is quite surprising, but there may be a reverse causal effect. So it is not because, this is maybe because irregular migrants do not return that policymakers implement measures to encourage them to return, and not the opposite. And so yes, I also wanted to give you some other results on the role of aspirations, and these results show that when migrants have the initial intention to return, they are more likely to return. So this is not surprising, but it shows that migrants who return are those who wanted to return. They had this, they intended to return, and those who intended to settle permanently in Europe, they are less likely to return. Some other factors to illustrate the role of aspirations as well. So the probability to return is also higher for students, because students, they went to Europe to acquire human capital, and they know that it will be easier it will be quite easy for them to improve their living conditions in Senegal. Once they will be back, they will find a job more easily. The probability to return is also higher for migrants in Europe for more than 3 years, so it means that migrants need some time to acquire the resources. Before 3 years, they are less likely to return. And that those who have never visited Senegal since their arrival, they are also more likely to return, because so they save money for their reintegration, and they don't waste money in going back and forth during their migration in Europe. And those who have children and spouse in Senegal, they're also more likely to return in comparison with those who have their family with them in Europe. So in conclusion, my research shows the important role of migrants' aspiration for return. But however, the preoccupation of migrants, it is not only the return, but also the possibility of a new migration after the return. And my main message is that the policies aiming at limiting immigration, they discourage migrants to return, and they tend to push them into a longer settlement in destination countries. Thank you.